Once you've checked it, please accept it. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie komisarzu. Przystępujemy do wystąpień w imieniu grup politycznych.
Thank you. We now move on to interventions on behalf of the political groups. On behalf of the EPP, Madame Grostet.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, there is one clear principle. The power of a president is to make appointments to strategic and political posts, and this is the result or consequence of democratic elections. Thank you, Commissioner, for all the explanations that you've brought to us, because appointments mustn't mean adopting powers in a high administration thanks to arrangements among friends or to the detriment of people lower down. What better to give grist to the mill to the Eurosceptics and entertain the myth and perpetuate the myth of things going on behind closed doors? In 2014, our group was in favour of a more political, less technocratic, more transparent Europe close to the citizens, with the policies taking place and before administrative procedures. But now we have non-elected civil servants steering the institution, and last-minute commissioners disappearing or not turning up. The legitimacy of the top civil servants whose skill or competence is not questioned should be reinforced by and strengthened by open and transparent procedures. However, this discredits an institution that we know is made up mainly of very talented professional people who have been taken on to really bring the European project forward. Now, Europe doesn't belong to civil servants, but to the citizens of Europe. The first are there to serve the second and not to help themselves or forward their own interests. It would be very good if we could remind ourselves of that. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani poseł. Mimo wszystko.
Thank you very much. But can I ask you to stick to the speaking time? Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to say anything about the professional, personal qualities of Mr. Martin Selmayr. Mr. Kender said what his qualifications were, and that he said that the rules were complied with in appointing the new Secretary General. So why are we not happy? Well, when we're living at a time when there's Brexit in the air and a lot of populism around, and the European project is called into question, by promoting Mr. Selmayr, it gives the impression to the outside world that people are being moved around, and this is grist to the mill to the Eurosceptics and promotes a lack of understanding in the general population. So, Mr. Commissioner, how are you going to recreate this confidence in the general populace? We're going to be entering an amendment for the budget procedure to the effect that in the future the best candidate will be found to fill high posts. That's not just for the Commission, it's going to be for the Council and the Parliament as well. So there should be a transparent procedure to find the best candidate. I hope we'll be able to work with you on this and that you'll understand what I'm driving at. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much.
Stugeracz grupy INF. Czy zechce pan przyjąć to pytanie?
There's a question, Mr. Stocker. Can you accept that?
Odmowa. Przepraszam. Wobec tego następnym mówcą jest pan Jan Zahradil, grupa konserwatystów.
I now give the floor to Mr. Zahradil.
Thank you, Mr. President. My group has tabled a set of questions. Unfortunately, we haven't received sufficient responses to that from Commissioner, and I hope that he still will go back to those 4 questions. You have argued that everything was in compliance with the rules. One thing are rules, the other thing is the impression. Let me add a few more questions to what we have originally tabled. I have no special information. Everything what I've got came from open sources, from the media. Is it true that on February 19th, where heads of cabinet met to prepare college meeting, no mention of appointment was on the agenda or any other business, while on 21st of February it was there, and the whole procedure of appointment of the Secretary General took just 9 minutes, where Mr. Selmayr was first appointed Deputy Secretary General, then the Secretary General of the European Commission resigned, and then Mr. Selmayr was appointed as the Secretary General. Second question, was he the only candidate or were there more candidates? Third questions, again from the media. Is it true that the minutes of the February 21st Commission meeting were, so say, amended to include a discussion about the merits of non-existent multiple candidates? Mr. Commissioner, there's a lot of interesting surroundings over that appointment, and I think that you should do your best to come out with something which is trustworthy, and you should avoid any feeling or any impression that it was a pre-prepared, politically motivated nomination. And unfortunately, I don't think that in this case you did your job perfectly. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo. W imieniu Grupy Liberałów pani.
Thank you very much. Madam in 't Veld.
Quite frankly, you've just made matters a lot worse. Coming here and taking MEPs for stupid, telling us that, you know, about the wonderful new clothes of the emperor and expecting us to believe that is a stupid strategy. And it just underlines the point that I want to make here today. Today's debate is not about staff policy. It is about the total lack of political judgment of this Commission. And that also applies to the absence of Mr. Juncker, who likes to talk about his political commission. But politics also means political accountability. He should be here to be held accountable for a political decision. Now, I am left completely speechless at the scene of 28 powerful politicians selected for the political leadership of this continent, but led by the nose by a civil servant. The political commission of Mr. Juncker sheepishly signing on the dotted line. Yes, Mr. Oettinger, that's what you've been doing. And if the commissioners are so easily intimidated by a civil servant, if they act like helpless children when confronted with an unexpected staff decision, then how can we expect them to stand up for the European interests against Trump, for example, in a trade war, or resist pressures from powerful lobbies, or be firm with national governments that violate the EU rules? Maybe that part of the House could have the courtesy to hear me out. Okay? Now, Selmayrgate destroys all the credibility of the European Union as a champion of integrity and transparency in public administration. At times when public trust in the European is low, this is devastating, Mr. Oettinger. And the fact that the Commission remains deaf until the day of today to criticism shows how disconnected it is from reality. So, in conclusion, the Commission will have to choose what is more important, the career of Mr. Selmayr or the credibility of the European Union. Because the appointment of Mr. Selmayr was a grave error and it must be corrected. And that is a precondition for our continued support for this Commission.
Dziękuję bardzo pani in 't Veld. Bardzo proszę.
Thank you very much, Ms. in 't Veld. Now, Mr. Philippe Lambert on behalf of the Greens.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, today we're seeing increasing hostility towards the European project. What should we expect from the Commission? They have to reconnect with society's needs. They have to be open to diversity of approach and all types of economy. They have to come out of their bunkers that they've closed themselves in on day after day. As Maria Montessori said, we have to ensure that the Commission is represents excellence. Nobody is questioning the talent or the abilities of the person in question, of Mr. Selmayr. However, we have to remember that he is a party man above all. Martin Selmayr is moving forward with authoritarian centralization. He wants civil servants to obey rather than be creative. The objective is just to have one line, just to see one face, and that be his.
Dziękuję bardzo. W imieniu grupy.
Thank you very much. For GUI, Mr. de Jong.
Voorzitter.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I have to say that I'm extremely disappointed at what Mr. Oettinger has just told us in a couple of minutes. We're being treated like children. It's like we're whinging about something that we're supposed to know, namely that the Commission does everything openly. Whereas the truth is that everything stinks when it comes to this appointment. It's all been done behind closed doors. The second appointment, Secretary General, how can it be that the Commission was surprised that Mr. Selmayr was proposed as Secretary General? Don't treat us as children. The same happened with Mr. Katainen, who also told us that he'd tell us what friendship was when he went to have a glass of wine with Mr. Barbarossa. He wasn't in any way a lobbyist, but this is the real truth. Mr. Barbarossa had promised that there would be no lobbyism, and that was not maintained. So, and if he had not stick to that, we'd have to do something about Mr. Barroso. And this is why we put this subject on the agenda. We don't want to be treated like children. I really felt that past weekend we were back in the Santerre Commission 1999, a problem of integrity, and the problem was swept under the carpet, and you know that everything was done. And if we're going to have the same problem, if we have this arrogant attitude from the Juncker Commission, and when we have the inquiry by the Budgetary Control Committee, we want all the facts on the table. Thank you.
W imieniu grupy EFDD, pan Nigel Farage.
Thank you, EFDD, Mr. Farage.
The fast-track appointment of Martin Selmayr to a €20,000 a month job done without any openness, without any transparency. In fact, his photograph was on the European Commission website before the meeting even took place, so well done on that score. No, what you've done, I think, is to bring a bit more light onto the European Commission. I want the citizens to know that the European Commission is the government of Europe. It is unelectable. We can't vote for them, we can't remove them, and yet they have the sole right to make law. And people need to understand how their money is being spent. This is Juncker's favourite bureaucrat, a fanatic who is now the most powerful bureaucrat in the world, and all of it done without an open procedure. You've done the peoples of Europe a great service. It is the perfect stitch-up. It smacks of nepotism, unaccountable government, abuse of public funds. Thank God the UK is leaving.
Dziękuję bardzo. Jako następny mówca pan Olaf Stuger.
Thank you very much.
Voorzitter, dank u wel. Voorzitter, ik ben geschokt.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm shocked, but not by the employment procedure of Martin Selmayr, but rather the fact that people are not trusting Mr. Juncker. Don't we know Mr. Juncker as a true trustful person, somebody you can trust to steer the ship, somebody who puts himself last and the European citizen first. He is the idol for a number of world leaders, and now he is having mud slung at him. And I can't accept it. I think we should have the right procedure. I would suggest that the European elections next year should be cancelled, and Mr. Juncker should be given the power to appoint members of the European Parliament on a personal basis. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan Bruno Gollnisch jako poseł niezrzeszony. Bardzo.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gollnisch.
Monsieur Oettinger, vous nous prenez vraiment.
You know, Mr. Oettinger, you really think we are children, don't you? Not responding to the questions about the appointment of Mr. Martin Selmayr, appointed just overnight Deputy Secretary General, then Secretary General. You know, you said they really held lengthy meetings. On the 21st of February, the meeting began at 9:30 in the morning, and the announcement by the press, the release went out early in the morning for a 10:30 meeting. I don't know. If there hadn't been any candidates, then this would have been an illegal appointment anyway. We would have to put a male candidate and a female candidate. So Clara Martinez Alberola was the person who was called in, deputy collaborative, working with Mr. Selmayr. She actually agreed to withdraw. I'm sure she was handsomely rewarded for that, to leave the place and pave the way for Mr. Selmayr. I mean, what's legal about this? I don't know. The final question, however, which is very important, is how come the 27 commissioners were so kindly disposed towards this procedure? Is it because Mr. Selmayr suggested that their expenses for former commissioners be increased from 40% to 67% of the basic salary? Is it because he promised all the commissioners, all the former commissioners, that they would have an office in the commission, that they would have a chauffeur-driven car, 2 assistants, so that they would end up getting double or treble what they get at the moment? These are the kind of questions that we need answers to.
Dziękuję bardzo. Przechodzimy do wystąpień indywidualnych.
Thank you very much. We go on to individual speeches. Mr. Montenegro.
Thank you, President. Obviously, the President of Secretary General of the Commission is an extremely important one. It must assure the functioning of all services, the balance, the exchange of information between general directorates, exchange of information with Parliament, and more importantly, the implementation of the political decisions of the College of Commissioners, without, of course, straying too far from those decisions. That civil servant must not have opinions, but rather implement those decisions as they are. That is why I believe the procedure, the appointment procedure, must be very transparent, and it must encourage the participation of a large number of civil servants, of functionaries, so that the best person may be chosen for the position. It is the only way the Commission can prove its credibility. I believe that the intervention of the Budgetary Control Committee is very welcome in this case. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo proszę panią Pervenche.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pervenche Perez.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Vice President, do I have to read Article 4 of the Statutes of Civil Servants in Europe? Any vacancy brought to the knowledge of the staff once the appointing authority decides that they have to replace fill this vacancy. Why, contrary to what you told us today, was the procedure not followed? Why? did Mrs. Clara Martinez withdraw her candidature before the interview, before a hearing? Where do we have the hearing of a male and female candidate? Why were people not informed in due time? Vice President, you are so keen to ensure the rules are respected and abided by. How could you be happy with this clear violation of the spirit and letter of the law? How could you take the risk of taking on this commission that Mr. Juncker wanted to be a commission of last resort, which also gives rise to Eurosceptical debates within its ranks, where we want it to be the guardian of the treaties? How can you violate the spirit of the institutions so that people who are working there should be serving the citizens and not helping themselves? We should be doing this in an exemplary manner here. And we should ensure that we are very vigilant with regard to our own institutions. But Mr. Vice President, you were saying these untruths, these counter-truths, whatever the qualifications of Mr. Selmayr, he didn't have the legal qualifications in terms of employment for the post, and you wanting to promote women by asking the female Deputy Vice Secretary General to withdraw her candidacy is hardly respecting the desire to promote gender equality.
Peter van Dalen.
Thank you very much. Peter van Dalen.
Next.
Voorzitter.
Chairman, Brussels has a very negative taste for a lot of citizens, and this is exactly what the President Commission has done. He's given his friend Selmayr a good job. Not much seems to have changed. Heinrich Heine says is quite right. It's an old tale, but it keeps being repeated. Mr. Juncker keeps accusing the different member states of not being clear. He's doing exactly the same. He keeps saying that everything has been done religiously according to the rules. We've had a very simplistic answer from Oettinger, and that shows that the Commission has no political antenna. Mr. Selmayr is now in office. We've got a big problem. We know that this is not decent. We should have a proper procedure. Only in that way can we slightly limit the damage. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan Ramon Tremosa.
Thank you very much. Tremosa Ibalis.
Thank you, President.
Lieber Kommissar Oettinger, first of all, we should ask where is President Juncker, because he should be, not you, the best person to answer the double promotion of Mr. Selmayr, approved of the college meeting last 21st of February. But, Mr. Oettinger, I have some questions to you. How long before were you informed that Mr. Selmayr was the only candidate for this post? Too many observers think Mr. Selmayr's double promotion did not respect at least two articles of the Statute of EU Civil Servants. Article 29 requires an internal competition of the vacant post of Deputy Secretary General. Mr. Selmayr only had the grade of Director, and he was appointed Deputy Secretary General. Mr. Oettinger, for how long did he hold this post? Article 4 requires the appointing authority and the staff of the European Commission to be informed. This was not the case. So, Mr. Oettinger, was it a fake internal competition? It seems an abuse of power. I welcome the fact that EU Ombudsman is analysing this affair. And please, colleagues, these behaviours and abuses of powers are fuelling anti-European sentiments all over Europe. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan Bart Stas.
Thank you very much. Mr. Stas.
Voorzitter, collega's, commissaris.
President, Ladies and gentlemen, this is discussion about integrity and rules. You say that all the rules have been complied with, but if you look at the dossier, you can see that it stinks to high heavens. First of all, this procedure ran very quickly. 31st of January was when the vacancy was announced. External evaluations, 15th of February, 16th of February, discussion with the advisory committee, interview with Minister Juncker on the 21st, and appointment to the post of Secretary General on the 21st. That's a world record. And the vacancy wasn't dealt with properly. We didn't have a number of applicants. It wasn't a transparent procedure, and the appointment to Secretary General on the 21st of February was not notified. It was not noted in minutes anywhere. It was just one document for the 28th Commission. It was a bit of a deus ex machina procedure. This needs to be looked into, and it will be looked into by the Budgetary Control Committee. Don't treat us like children. We don't expect high officials to act in this rushed fashion and in such a dishonest way.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, we're here discussing a shady bureaucrat, Mr. Selmayr, that no European citizen knows. Why not? Because Mr. Selmayr is now sitting on one of the main Commission thrones. The problem is that we know that he is now head of Juncker's cabinet and whose interests he's defending. Now, I'm not questioning the formal correctness of how he was nominated, but the political role of the Commission and its president, and also the role that ethics has to play in public life. I ask myself and you, colleagues, are the President of the Commission and Commissioners only technical appointments without any responsibilities, or are they politicians? If they are politicians, as Mr. Juncker has said many times here, then how can they respond to citizens who haven't elected them but who are subject to their decisions? Politicians, particularly those leading institutions, have to act with integrity, discipline, honour, and always act in a way which is ethically irreproachable. And they shouldn't just do this, but have to appear to do this. There can be no doubts as to their actions. Where are ethics and transparency here? What mechanisms for political sanctions can we enact when faced with this kind of behaviour? Neither President Juncker nor the Commissioner have been directly elected by citizens or can be subject to individual no-confidence motions. The vote recently in Italy has shown that citizens don't want this Europe anymore, closed off in its fortress of lobbyists, interests, German interests. There is a strong wind of change blowing in Europe, and you can no longer ignore it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nicolas Bay.
Oui, la nomination de Monsieur.
Yes, the appointment of Mr. Selmayr as Secretary General of the European Commission is outrageous. It is outrageous because this person close to Mrs. Merkel just adds to the long list of Germans abusively appointed in key posts in the European institutions. It's scandalous because this appointment, which is totally arbitrary, disregards all the recruitment rules in place in the institution and is a win of the bureaucratic superstructure over the political beings that we are with the responsibilities that we have. The European Union is forever giving lessons to the whole world, and there the former Prime Minister of a tax haven wants to put his Chief of Staff at the head of the administration of the European Executive. And Mr. Juncker, instead of coming to explain, sends Mrs. Oettinger, the German commissioner, also chosen by Mrs. Merkel. So what contempt for the Parliament and the citizens we represent. With the same contempt, the bureaucrats that are not elected in the Commission with exorbitant powers allow themselves to challenge decisions that are legal and legitimate taken by democratic governments elected, such as Poland and Hungary.
Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo proszę, pani przewodnicząca.
Thank you very much. And now we will have Ingeborg Geisler. President, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't know how many of you were able to read all the rules and regulations. I congratulate you. We've decided that the Budgetary Controls Committee will look into this. We will look at all these questions, and normally we do this in the committee first and then in the plenary, and perhaps we should have done that in this case as well. I think you're all welcome to ask questions you have. I would like to speak in favor of equal opportunities here and in the Commission as well. I note what the Commissioner has said. He has said that the rules and the statutes have been complied with. There were 2 assessments. We haven't a change to the status, and that's important for you to say that. There's no change in the statute for former commissioners, no drivers, officers, or anything else. I don't think there's any doubt that Mr. Selmayr is competent. I think this is the most important thing when you are looking at promotions. The rest, we will look at you in our committee and we will try and clarify the situation. Thank you.
Również Komisja Kontroli Budżetowej, koordynator Grupy Socjalistów i Demokratów, pani.
The coordinator, Mr. Alessander.
Thank you. I would agree that the Budget Control Committee should ask the necessary questions to Mr. Oettinger. However, Mr. Oettinger, we've spent this Parliament years asking for some changes to how the high posts are nominated without having been listened to. And perhaps we should welcome this. The whole process is being affected by the way in which Mr. Selmayr has been nominated. Of course, we have to look at the consequences of all of this. A social pillar, Horizon 2020, the main key areas of the Commission. Now, we should be talking about this, and now all we're talking about how the institutions work or don't work. The College of Commissioners has brought it to a state where the Parliament is now having to discuss this and perhaps make some discussions. When it comes to discharge and the Budget Control Committee, this is where we normally carry out this type of scrutiny. Now we're going to have this hearing and look at it in more depth. Mr. Oettinger, I know you can do this. I would ask you to tell us that before the end of the year, as the Social have asked, you and the Commission will set out a proposal for how nominations of high office holders should be done, and that it should be as transparent as possible, and then it should expect equality. And I think the Commission and Europe needs this in its future.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan Anders Vistisen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vistisen.
Man skal være både blind,
You need to be blind, deaf and stupid to believe in what Mr. Oettinger said, namely that this appointment was in accordance with the letter and the spirit of the law. So I feel sorry for Mr. Oettinger today. I'm sorry that Mr. Juncker has chosen to send a messenger to explain to the Parliament why the Commission is insisting on discrediting the highest level of the Commission with political appointments. This is going to damage the European Commission, not just today when we're discussing this appointment, but also in upcoming years. If the European citizens cannot believe that the people in the highest positions in the Commission have been appointed because of their qualities as neutral officials, as watchdogs of the treaty, and as those people who neutrally should translate the ambitions of the Parliament and the Council and the Commission. It's a real shame that Mr. Juncker has not had the courage to come along here today himself. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo proszę, pan Sven Giegold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sven Giegold.
Commissioner, colleagues, now what we've seen happen over the last few weeks has really made the European Union vulnerable in terms of public opinion. We're talking about fast-track promotions, flash promotions, and this may be legal according to the rules, but to public opinion it doesn't really represent the transparency and openness and clear procedures with equal opportunities and gender equality that people have come to expect. I'm not going to question the candidate's competence, but you shouldn't try to act as though everything was fine and nothing was wrong, whereas there are lots of legitimate questions being raised. You have to draw consequences from this scandal and make use of the rules on transparency and not try to avail of the loopholes in the rules. Everything must be carried out transparently, and the decisions must be clearly put on the agendas of the different bodies. Ensure that this cannot be exploited by Eurosceptics when it comes to the European elections.
Thank you very much. Shetland.
Thank you, President. The facts really do point in a particular direction. The Commission has made a very senior appointment without following its own procedures adequately, certainly as far as transparency is concerned. Now, this has flawed consequences. It demonstrates that checks and balances are, shall we say, missing from the work of the Commission. Equally, that when it suits the Commission, it ignores the rules, meaning the rule of law. Following procedure is a necessary part of the rule of law. And if the Commission is ready to ignore its own rules, why should anyone pay a blind bit of attention to what the Commission says about flaws in the rule of law in Member States or anywhere else for that matter?
Dziękuję bardzo. Teraz bardzo proszę pan Mark.
Thank you very much. Mr. Demesmaeker. Commissioner Oettinger, what you're saying really shows what a bubble you're living in. Outside, you've got citizens who are wondering about this sudden appointment, and you come along with a presentation which has nothing to do with the questions that are being asked. We're not saying anything about the person of Martin Selmayr. He's no doubt brilliant. It's the way this appointment has been orchestrated, the intrigue, the cronyism. It's about the way the Commission works as a whole. It shows that collegiality within the Commission is not real. It's a matter of power and influence and a lack of communication. You say that you religiously followed the rules, but I listened to the parable of the Pharisees when I was a child, somebody who follows the rules of the Bible, but who's actually just an illustration of somebody who thinks they're the greatest. We hear a lot of people talking about Putin and Trump, but the real challenge to the Commission for the future is you. Pascal Durand.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Mr. Oettinger. Fraud corrupts everything. when you're trying to make this Parliament believe that someone who's been nominated Secretary General occupied that for 3 minutes in order to avoid outside scrutiny and then be nominated to the next rung up is a normal procedure to becoming Secretary General, leading 33 million people. I don't know what to say to you or to the... You're taking us for idiots. You're lying. No independent authority would accept being treated like this. You should be ashamed. Mr. Oettinger, what you and the Commissioner are doing for Europe is worse than all of the nationalists, the Eurosceptics, the extremists. You are undermining the whole project and democracy in Europe.
Dziękuję bardzo. Następny mówca, pan Werner.
Thank you. Mr. Werner Langen has the floor. Thank you, Mr. President. I have no doubts about the legal competencies or professional competencies, but I do have questions about the procedure. Mr. Selmayr was active not as a German civil servant, for those who want to put this on Germany's back, but what he doesn't have is the experience in various departments. He was never head of department, none of this. The whole procedure was anything but transparent. It reminds us of the 19th century secret bureaucracy. In the past, we've also worried about, other problems. We wanted to have Schulz again as president of the Parliament, but at the end of the day, what I say is that this is a disproportionate backdoor taking of power. So you've managed it again in the Commission. Now, it reminds me of a puppet show, really, with people pulling the strings behind in the back, and the puppets just do what we see them do.
Pozwalają sobie przekraczać limit.
Thank you. I can see that we've gone over the speaking time, but it's very interesting, so I'm not interrupting people, but please stick to your speaking time. Mr. Eickhout.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oettinger. It's quite clear that your initial intervention completely missed the point. It was formalistic, it was too thin. You just said everything was done in accordance with the letter of the law. But you know that there are rules that you have to follow to the letter, but also the spirit, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about credibility, we're talking about transparency, we're talking about decency and honesty, things that the Commission are supposed to stand for. So you were weak in your first phase. You could say how you think the rules can be applied so that the next time we don't have this kind of rushed procedure, how we can have an open and honest procedure so that we can have faith in the appointment of officials within the Commission. That's very important. It's unfortunate that you need rules to stick to that. I think we need to hear from you how you think this can be improved. Otherwise, you are not worth. It's not worth you being here.
Thank you. So that ends that procedure, and we start the catch the eye procedure now. We have 10 names on the list. I think we have enough time for that. Mr. van der Kedelaere first.
President, integrity is one of the most valuable things in politics. You can be as good as politician as you want, but if you don't have integrity, nobody will believe you and you will not achieve anything. And this is particularly the situation in the European institutions. So we have to really sit up and take notice when we're talking about integrity. I've been listening to the debate. Quite apart from the individual qualities of people, it's a matter of how things were done. So can I ask the Commissioner to confirm that not only was the procedure followed correctly, but that rumours about drivers and so on for retiring commissioners are a complete fabrication?
Next speaker is on the catch the eye list is Mr. Andriev. The floor is yours for 1 minute. Mr. Andriev.
Yes. Madame la Présidente. Au moment où...
Thank you, Madam Chair. The world is changing. We're seeing conservatism on the rise and protectionism in the United States. We're seeing what's happening in North Korea. When Bashar al-Assad is continuing his actions without anything being done, when Erdogan is killing the Kurds, we're talking about the fact that the leader of the European Commission cannot even respect rules that he himself created. And it's a Corsican tango, which is 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. We're seeing that with the president of this parliament. He's saying he wants to be prime minister. The whole world is laughing at us in the European Parliament. We have responsibility. What role can Europe play on a global scale? What we're showing today is that we're not up to that level to play a role on the world stage.
Thank you. Mr. Oettinger. Mr. Juncker should have been here, sitting where you are now. You shouldn't be answering in his place. He should be here because he needs to shoulder his responsibilities. Because when all this came out and became public, he said it was his right to appoint anyone he likes as Secretary General. Because he was comparing himself to Mr. Macron, Mrs. Merkel, and said just as they appoint whomsoever they wish to have as Secretary General, he could do the same in the Commission. So he should have come here to really defend his positions, this rather provocative, illegal behaviour, because this is what he said in his statements. From this discussion and from what you have said, there are even more questions that have been raised, because clearly the selection the choice was made to have this person Deputy Secretary General and the next day Secretary General. But it's not you who should be here. Mr. Juncker should have come here himself to defend his positions.
Thank you so much. A következő beszélünk pedig Mr. Ferreira. Parancsoljon, uram.
Mr. Ferreira.
Obrigado, Senhora Presidente. A política dita de...
Thank you, President. Integrity and transparency can be summarised as such. The European Commission is wholly in the services of financial institutions who are determining its own actions and the content of its initiatives. There can be nothing clearer than that. The unconditional defence of their interests require these very obscure procedures with questionable ethics, with no real transparency. This lack of integrity and transparency is not a one-off, it's structural. They might seem shocking, but all of these episodes show that this is a structural problem. This reality has to be fought on a much more systemic basis. How the Commission works with Goldman Sachs, who try to influence commissioners. We know that there is a democratic problem.
Madam President, I would like to congratulate Mr. Selmayr who has managed to have double promotion within 10 minutes. Unfortunately, the Parliament is not competent to do anything about this particular action. But the Commission is so hypocritical when it attacks certain member states on points of law, and it doesn't even keep a semblance of transparency in its own institution. We already know that certain practices follow the letter of the law but not the spirit. Interpretation of rules is arbitrary. Certain mechanisms and bodies are also questionable, and therefore we can only talk about responsibilities. We have to ensure that we point the finger at those who are responsible, and those are the Commission College, and they really should go.
Dank u, voorzitter.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Commissioner, there are some days when I'm ashamed to be a member of the European Parliament. And I have to say that this is a day like that. And it's not because I think that we're not doing useful work in looking at issues which are important for the European citizens. But when I look at the picture of Europe, then the picture of Europe today is that Europe is a matter of underhand appointments, things being done in the dark back rooms, weird and unclear promises being made to commissioners without anything being discussed here with the Parliament. I'm very glad that there's going to be an investigation, because I would like to be proud of the work I do here rather than being ashamed to be an MEP.
Beszélünk. Mrs. Ruonen Lerner, parancsoljon. 1 percre öné a szó.
Kiitos, rouva puhemies.
Thank you, Madam President. We've heard arguments that the Commission key post was not following a procedure. For the European taxpayer, it is important that all posts are filled with the best possible candidate without any discrimination, without any nepotism. The least that the Commission can now do is to tell us the truth, how they ended up with this appointment. Could we correct this? And if yes, how? Political appointments mean corruption. Is this the way the Commission is now going towards within the European Union? I ask myself.
Most pedig 1 percre megadom a szót Mr. Epitideos úrnak, parancsoljon. Gergodios Epitideos.
Ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Ο διορισμός.
Thank you. Now, the appointment of the political friend of Mr. Juncker as Secretary General of the European Commission, and this appointment, which was so sudden without transparency, is simply a coup in this institution. 28 commissioners were circumvented. They were simply spectators watching the events, and they probably had something to gain from not reacting. Member states couldn't intervene, and all of this has happened for an obvious reason. This small circle of leaders in Europe wants to put people in control of the institutions so that they can control the decisions taken. It's clear that the European Union has really moved away from the principles and values on which it was founded. It is there to serve the interests of globalization, and it has puppets in place to ensure that the decisions are taken as they wish. This will have to change. The corrupt politicians will really have to be dismissed.
Adom meg a szót, parancsoljon, képviselő asszony.
Dear colleagues, at the last plenary we were dealing with Mr. Barroso, former commissioner, now working for Goldman Sachs, coming back to bribe perhaps, or perhaps just influence the present Commission. At this plenary, we are talking about a political appointee becoming the Secretary General of the European Commission in violation of all the relevant rules. In the meantime, the European Union, the same European Union dares to have Article 7 proceedings against my country, Hungary, and against Poland for the violation of the rule of law. Don't you think that you should immediately, after this very session, stop these Article 7 proceedings and start proceedings instead against yourselves? Thank you.
Asszony. Most pedig a bizottság nevében megadom a szót Oettinger úrnak, parancsoljon biztos úr.